I think the most important preparation was, first of all, just loving it, loving to read history. Whatever it is that you do, if you have that passion and desire for it, that's the most important thing. And then what I tried to do all through college and graduate school was to go to Washington every summer so that I could have an actual experience of government. I knew I was interested in American history and government, so I thought instead of just reading about it, I better find out about it in practical terms. So one summer I worked in the House of Representatives, another summer I worked in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and another summer I worked in the State Department, and then eventually I became a White House fellow and worked for Lyndon Johnson, and that probably was the single most important experience in orienting me to want to do presidential history, because I got to know this crazy character when I was only 23 years old. He's still the most formidable, fascinating, frustrating, irritating individual I think I've ever known in my entire life. He was huge. I mean, just as a huge character, not only standing 6'4", but when you talk to him, he violated the normal human space between people, so he would be right on top of you. You'd be sort of looking up into his chest. He had an enormous voice. He was a great storyteller. The problem was that half his stories I discovered weren't true. There was this great time I was swimming with him in this pool that he has at his ranch. It's an amazing pool that he created so that it could be a working pool. So at every moment when you're trying to swim in it, floating rafts came by with floating telephones on top of them, other floating rafts with floating desks and notepads. And in the middle of it, I had read an article that day by Hugh Sidey, a reporter, who had said that Johnson had given a great speech to the troops who were going to Vietnam in which he talked about patriotism. And in the speech, he mentioned that his great-great-grandfather had died at the Battle of the Alamo. And Hugh Sidey said it was a wonderful speech. The only problem was that he didn't have a great-great-grandfather who died at the Alamo. He just wanted to have one so much that he'd kind of made him up. So I turned to President Johnson. I said, "How can you do that?" And he looked back at me and he said, "Oh, these journalists, they're such sticklers for detail." And it was then that I realized that I could only believe half of what he told me. But the stories were so much fun, and he loved politics. And even though his presidency was in many ways scarred forever by the war in Vietnam and destroyed in a lot of ways, he as a character was even larger than his presidency. So being able to get to know him well, I worked for him the last year in the White House and then helped him on his memoirs the last 4 years of his life before he died, spending summers and Christmases and every other weekend at the ranch. So that firsthand relationship with this large character, I think, is what drew me to writing books about presidents. That was my first book on Lyndon Johnson, and then the Kennedys and then the Roosevelts came after that. In a funny way, the memories that I took away from Lyndon Johnson were not so much the qualities of what made him a good leader. I did see some parts of that, the kind of ability to convince anybody to do anything he wanted them to, a belief in himself, a courage at some level, especially on civil rights. I think the one thing he'll be positively remembered for was that he was responsible for the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Open Housing Act, and he was a Southerner, but he somehow at some point came to believe that this was his destiny to do something for Black Americans. That part of him was the best part. But the part I remember most is that the man I saw in those last years in his retirement was really a desolate man because he was out of power, had absolutely no interests to keep him going once the presidency was gone. So that retirement was almost like a little death for him. He'd wake up in the morning and really not even know how to get through the days. And I think what it convinced me of more than anything was that that kind of success bought at that price isn't worth it unless you have other things to balance you. He had no hobbies, no interest in sports. His family loved him, but they couldn't fill the hole in him that he needed to be filled by the applause of millions. So he almost willed himself to die in those last years. He hardly ever left the ranch. The only comfort he got was having staff meetings in the morning, just as he used to in the White House, but no longer would it be telling people which bills were going to get through the committee on the Hill that day, but rather how many eggs he hoped to be laid in the ranch that day, or how many people he wanted to go through the LBJ library. He so wanted more people to go through the Johnson Library than were going through the Kennedy Library in Boston, that after a while he used to have them free donuts, coffee, anything, get them in there. And after a while, the librarians, knowing how much it mattered to him, used to have a clicker, so they would click themselves in and out over and over again just to give him an escalated count at the end of the week. So I think the experience taught me more than anything that if your ambition comes at the price of such an unbalanced life, that there's nothing else that gives you comfort but success, it's not worth it. And to see that at 23 years old was an incredibly invaluable lesson, because I think at that time you think work's the most important thing in your life and fame and success are what you're dreaming of. And yet to be able to know that if it's bought at that high a price, as I said, it's not worth it. I will always be grateful for that lesson. I think I was so aware of the privilege of having this man, for some reason, having chosen me to talk to. He talked to me about his mother, his father, his dreams, his sadnesses, and I realized that it was just a pretty lucky thing in some ways that he had chosen me to be there in those last years and used that information for that first book on Lyndon Johnson. But I think from then on, it made me want to understand the private side of the public figures because I'd had that connection with this first one I ever knew, so that the kind of books I wrote from then on were not simply the public side of Presidents Kennedy or President Roosevelt, but really what their lives were like in the White House at the same time. After the Lyndon Johnson book came out, I was still a professor at that time at Harvard. I taught in the government department there and actually taught a big course on the presidency. In fact, not long before Lyndon Johnson died, he called me and he said that he had this terrible feeling that no one was really going to remember him. And he had been reading Carl Sandburg's biography on Lincoln and trying to bring Lincoln to life, and he couldn't do it. And he said he now realized that maybe he would have been better off searching for his immortality through his children and their children in turn, instead of through the fickleness of the American public, who were now preoccupied with Nixon, his successor. And I remember trying to tease him out of that and saying, oh, they'll always remember you. I'll put a question on every exam on you, because I was teaching this course on the presidency. And he said, you're not listening to me. I'm telling you something important. Get married, have children, and spend time with them. Only 2 weeks after that, he was dead. He died of a heart attack at his ranch. So I think I spent about 3 or 4 more years after his death finishing my book on Lyndon Johnson. And once it came out, because of the way it was received and the pleasure I had in writing it, I decided that I wanted to be a writer. Up until that time, I think I saw myself mostly as a professor writing on the side. But at that point, I had gotten married, had 3 kids, and couldn't do it all. I couldn't be a teacher and a writer and a mother. So I had to choose. So I gave up teaching at Harvard in order to become a full-time historian, which is what I've been ever since. When you spend as long as it takes, it does me anyway, to write these biographies. It took me 5 years on Lyndon Johnson, 10 years on the Kennedys, 6 years on the Roosevelt. Inevitably, you get shaped by the people that you're thinking about during that period of time. And as I said, I think with Lyndon Johnson, the most important thing I learned was that he never had the sense of security that comes from inside. It always depended on other people making him feel good about himself, which meant that he was always beholden, in a certain sense, to continually needing to succeed. He could never stop. There was such a restlessness in him. And I think some people who go into public life, if they go in needing the applause of thousands, they're never going to work out successfully in the end, because they don't know who they are apart from the crowds. And I think that was the lesson that I learned most from him. You can be enormously effective for a period of time, because it's almost like there's an engine in you that needs to keep going, and you have a greater drive than other people who may be more happy and balanced in life, because you have to keep going out and proving yourself over and over again. He told me that his mother loved him greatly, but always made him feel that unless he kept succeeding, she would withdraw love from him. If he came home with a bad report card, for instance, she would actually pretend that he had died. She would sit at the dinner table and say to her husband and his brother, "Isn't it too bad Lyndon has gone from us?" And that's a pretty severe statement, to make somebody feel that unless I keep succeeding, there's not going to be anything for me there. He even had a certain warehouse at the ranch where each time you went to visit him, he felt compelled to give you a gift, almost as if you wouldn't come back unless he could buy your friendship by more and more gifts, and actually had the gifts arranged in shelves so that each time you went to visit him, you got to choose from a higher and higher shelf, so that you, as you became an intimate friend, you finally made it to the top shelf, almost like at an amusement park. So at the beginning, I was just getting certificates that I'd flown on Air Force One, and then finally I got a scarf that had his name printed on it 500 times, until finally, this is an incredibly crazy story, I got to the top shelf after about a year and a half, and he told me that he was so excited to give me this gift because it meant that we were very close friends, and he loved it so much too, because it meant that I would think of him every morning and every night when I opened this wonderful gift. And I opened it up, and inside was the largest electric toothbrush I'd ever seen in my life, with his picture on one side and the formal presidential seal on the other side. I thought, oh my God, this man is right. I will think of him every morning and every night. But as I say, I think that need that he had, somehow I would have gone back to see him. I didn't need gifts, but he felt almost like the gifts that he gave the country, the civil rights laws, the student loans, the poverty programs, Medicaid, were what would make the people love him in return. And I don't think it works that way. I think as a president, you have to want respect. You can't look for love from the American people. You have to just do what you think is right. Some people will hate you, but others in the long run will respect you for what you've done. In the Kennedy situation, what was so interesting about studying the Kennedy family was that my husband had worked as a speechwriter for John Kennedy and was very close to Bobby Kennedy, with him when he died, actually. So I had access to 150 cartons of material that had been in the attic in Hyannisport for over 50 years that belonged to Joe and Rose Kennedy. So what interested me most about the Kennedys was the family situation. Somehow they had created this family that lasted over time. I mean, they had a sense of connection to one another, and especially in our nuclear age, where people are spread all over the country and they don't see grandparents and parents, this family bonded together. And I got myself even more interested in that than in John Kennedy's presidency. What was it that created this enormous ambition in that generation that they all had to succeed? And there it was a mixed story as well. I mean, I think John Kennedy had a great deal of confidence that came from his personality, but always in his family he felt he wasn't as good as his older brother, Joe Jr., who was the star of the family, more handsome, the better student, the more religious, the better kid in the family. And I think he always had to show up, this older brother. And when the older brother died in World War II, then suddenly there was an opening for John Kennedy to become something. It's interesting to imagine what might have happened if Joe Jr. had not died and he had become the first president. Then John Kennedy, as we know him, might never have emerged. So it showed how even place and family was so important in something like that, and what it was that Rose and Joe Kennedy Sr. were able to do to make these kids, usually the children of wealthy people, famous people, celebrities, have a tough time making their own way in the world. And yet they inculcated a sense of ambition in that next generation that's very unusual compared to Roosevelt's children, none of whom became anything like Franklin Roosevelt. Joe Kennedy's kids, when you look at Teddy and Bobby and Jack Kennedy and the girls, Eunice Shriver at Special Olympics, they've all been driven to succeed, even though they didn't have to do anything in their life because they could have been playboys and playgirls. So that's, I think, what interested me most about that. Oh, I think what drew me to the Roosevelts was really two things. One was I wanted to live back in the era of World War II. The book is mostly about Franklin and Eleanor during World War II. And it was a time in our life when the country was bounded together by a common enemy and a common goal, when there was a real sense of community in the land. And I just wanted to know, especially in contrast to today's world where there's so little belief in politics, in government, it's much more fragmented, our sense of nationhood. It was wonderful to go back and spend 6 years studying a time when the country really was bound together. And then I found absolutely fascinating, and there's no other parallel for it in our history, the partnership between Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think what was so revealing to me about that partnership was that in many ways it was born in the pain of Eleanor's discovery when she was married for 12 years that Franklin was having an affair with another woman named Lucy Mercer. She wanted a divorce, but it was the last thing he wanted. The important thing was he convinced her to stay together and promised her she could do whatever she wanted within the marriage, which meant that she went outside the marriage to become a teacher, to become a political activist, something that few women could do in 1918. If you were a married woman, you didn't run around outside. But that gave her, in some ways, this terrible catastrophe in their private life, gave her the freedom to go outside the marriage and become Eleanor Roosevelt. So it showed you that some things that you might think of as the greatest crises in your life can lead to opportunities, because Eleanor found that through public life she had a confidence that she didn't have in her private life. And then once they get into the presidency and he becomes paralyzed by polio, she becomes in many ways his eyes and his ears. Without her, his presidency never would have been as rich as it was. She traveled the country on his behalf, bringing him back a deep sense of what was happening in the land. She was much more active on civil rights, on poverty, on coal miners than he was, and really made his presidency more socially just than it would have been. And he would be the first to admit that she made him stronger, and then she admitted at the end of his life that without him, she wouldn't have had the platform to be Eleanor Roosevelt. So just knowing how you can go through very difficult times in your own married life and still form this extraordinary partnership, I think is what I took away from that book. I grew up in Rockville Center, Long Island. My family originally came from Brooklyn, but moved out to the suburbs in the 50s, as so many other people did, really. It was that time after the war when having your first home of your own meant a lot to our parents. I went to public high school in Long Island and then went on to Colby College in Maine and then to Harvard, where I got a PhD. But I've often thought that my love of history was rooted in the experience of when I was 6 years old, my father taught me that wonderful and mysterious art of keeping score so that when he went to work during the day, I could stay home and record the history of that day's Brooklyn Dodger game, play by play, inning by inning. And at night when he would come home and you're only 6 years old and he tells you you're doing great as a miniature historian, I think in some ways that made history have a magic that it still holds for me to this day. Then my mother was very sick from the time I was born and died when I was 14. So I think my love of books in some ways came from knowing that she was pretty much bound to the home and read all the time as a way of learning about other worlds that she would never be able to experience because she couldn't travel very much because of her heart condition. So books took on a certain kind of magic for me, just as the baseball scores did. So between those two experiences, somehow history and reading became a very important part of my childhood. Well, I think as so often happens, there was a teacher in my high school who went on to win an award actually as the best history teacher in all of New York State. And she taught American history, 20th century American history. And I'm not sure that it was the subject. I think no matter what she taught me, I would have loved it, had it been medieval history or Renaissance history. But she just made it come alive. And I think that was the beginning of sort of a young adult's love of history that then carried through later in my life. There was one in high school and then there was one in college. There was a teacher in college who made you feel that if you could understand everything he was saying, that somehow you'd understand truth, justice, everything. Later, I got to know him very well, and he was always somewhat obscure. And he said, when I said to him, if we could only figure out what you say, we would have understood everything. And he said, did you ever realize that I just might not have been clear, that I myself didn't know what I was saying? And I said, of course not. We just thought we weren't smart enough to figure out what you were saying. But he had that, again, that magical ability to make you want to understand things that were beyond your comprehension at that point. So those two teachers, I think, were really what did it for me. Louise Austin was the teacher in high school, and Al Mavernack was my teacher at Colby College. And never in all the years that I went to Harvard Graduate School, got a PhD, taught at Harvard for 10 years, there were never better teachers in that august institution than I had in those two schools. So it just shows that there are great teachers in all levels of institutions all over the country. I think so many kids think unless they go to one of these great Ivy League schools, which I was lucky enough to go to later, that they won't get the same kind of learning. But I learned just the opposite lesson, that my best teachers were not at Harvard University. Well, the interesting thing is, given that my most recent book was on Franklin Roosevelt, when I was in high school, there was a book by James McGregor Burns, a wonderful historian, called The Lion and the Fox, about FDR. And it was about his personality, his character, his early years in Hyde Park, his polio experience. And I remember that so vividly as the first real live history book that I loved so much. And I later met him and have gotten to know him as a colleague. And he's about 30 years older than I am, and I couldn't wait to tell him, you were the one who made it happen. Well, right now I'm working on a memoir about growing up in love with the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 1950s in Long Island. So I'm reading books on baseball almost entirely. Baseball is another huge love of mine, not only because of that keeping score experience from my father, but after the Brooklyn Dodgers left Brooklyn and went to Los Angeles, I later moved to Boston and became a Red Sox fan. So I have season tickets to the Red Sox, live and die by this crazy team. And at the moment I'm reading memoirs to understand really the whole form of memoirs and loving reading memoirs, and at the same time reading books about baseball. I certainly don't think I thought of myself as a writer early on. In fact, in high school, I used to mistakenly leave essays until the last minute because it was so hard to write, and I thought if I didn't start writing it until 10 the night before it was due, at least it wouldn't be paining me for too long. I would not recommend that as something to people, but I don't even think in college writing is what I thought. I think I thought of myself more as going actively into public life, into politics itself. And that desire to go to Washington in the summers when I was in college and graduate school was partly seeing if I could enjoy public life. And indeed, when I had first gotten married, President Carter asked me to be the head of the Peace Corps. And it was a job that I would have loved a decade before, and really might have had I done a good job, and it led to a cabinet post or something in the administration, which is what I think I'd always dreamed of. But at the time, my little kids were 1 and 2 years old and 8 years old, and there was no way in the world I could take a job that made me travel all around the world. I remember when I told that to the White House, they understood that perfectly. But then I added in, and you see, I'm also a season ticket holder to the Red Sox, and I think this is the year we're going to win the World Series, so I can't travel around the world. There was this great silence at the other end, as if they were saying, oh my God, thank God this woman didn't take the job. What's the matter with her anyway? And I've realized that might have been a turning point in the road, because I didn't take that. And then, Even now, perhaps I've gotten involved to some extent with the Clinton White House. I'm on a commission on campaign finance reform, but now I want nothing more than to be a writer. I've chosen to be a commentator and an analyzer of politics rather than an actual doer of it. And I think it could have gone the other way, but I'm not sorry that it didn't, because this made it easier to be home with my kids and to spend time with them. Writing you can do right in your house. You don't have to go anywhere. I decided when my two little kids were 1 and 2 years old to give up being a professor at Harvard. Harvard had been an identity. I mean, when you are connected to a university, and especially one like Harvard, you go places and you say, I'm a Harvard professor. They know who you are. I had written my Lyndon Johnson book, but I didn't have the same confidence that I could be as good a writer as I thought I was as a teacher. So it was scary to give up that umbrella in a certain sense. But I knew that if I could spend the time writing and being at home with my kids, that if I could do that, it would give me more satisfaction because I wouldn't feel torn in a million directions as I was feeling. And luckily, it really did work out, because I don't think I would have had the chance to write the book on the Kennedys, to write the book on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, if I was also trying to teach. I think I would have been doing things sort of half well all the way through. But it wasn't so easy at that time. And I remember when I was writing the Kennedy book, after I gave up the teaching at Harvard, and I was at a cocktail party, and I heard somebody say, without realizing I could hear them, well, whatever happened to Doris Kearns anyway, as if somehow I had died because I no longer was a public figure. And I remember wanting to hit them and say, I've had 3 kids, that's what's happened to me. But it all has worked out. I mean, I couldn't ask for more than the kind of recognition that I've gotten as an historian, but I didn't know that at the time when I gave up something that was of value to me. But I had to do it because I wasn't happy trying to be moved in a million directions at that same time. I thought about this so much because during the 6 years that I worked on the book, there's so many times when I wanted to talk to both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And then when this whole thing came out with Hillary, I kept thinking, oh my God, they'll think I'm crazy too. I'm having seances with these dead people. I think the most important thing that I wanted to say at various times to Franklin and Eleanor was that it seemed so sad to me that I really believed they loved each other and had a great deal of affection. But because of that early hurt in their marriage, there was a certain kind of distance from then on until their deaths, actually. And at times, one would reach out to the other to try and break that distance, and then the other one would pull away, and another time the other one would reach out. So at times I just wanted to push them together and say, come on, you guys, I know you love each other. This is crazy. Because I could see as I read their letters, as I did interviews with people, that they both wanted the other one, but there was too much pain and hurt to fully get back together again. So I think that's what I would have talked to them about. But it was funny, when this whole thing happened with Hillary, I knew that she had spent a lot of time thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt, because after she finished reading my book, she invited my husband and me to sleep overnight in the White House, because the book takes place on the second floor of the family quarters of the White House during the war. And during Roosevelt's time, an amazing group of people lived there, including Franklin's secretary, Missy LeHand, who was in love with Franklin Roosevelt, never married, and in many ways was his other wife when Eleanor traveled as much as she did. Harry Hopkins, his closest advisor, had a bedroom right next door to his. And then a woman reporter, Lorena Hickok, was in love with Eleanor. She had a bedroom next to Eleanor. Winston Churchill lived up there for months at a time during the war, drinking all day long. And this beautiful princess from Norway, Princess Martha, would come in and spend the weekends. So when I wrote the book, I kept saying to myself, and saying when I talked about it in public, what would the modern press ever make of this Roosevelt White House where all these people are floating around? And I mentioned on a radio show in Washington that I would love to see the second floor once more, because I'd been up there with Lyndon Johnson, but at 23 years old, I never thought of asking, where did Franklin Roosevelt sleep? Where did Eleanor sleep? But for that whole 6 years of working on the book, that was the location of most of the story, took place in the second floor. So it happened that Hillary Clinton overheard me say this on the radio show, called up the radio station, and invited me to sleep overnight in the White House. She said then I could wander the corridors and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years before. So 2 weeks later, my husband and I went to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the President and Mrs. Clinton and my husband and I went through every room up there and figured out who had been there. And it was great because we realized we were ending up staying in Winston Churchill's bedroom. So the whole night I could hardly sleep. I was sure he was sitting in the corner smoking his cigar and drinking his brandy. And I think there's something about that White House that is such an extraordinary, simple, beautiful place in our nation's history. And when you're there, for example, right across from the room where we were staying was the room where Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so you think, oh my God, he was in there in that room. And then you'll see the tree that Andrew Jackson planted. And then at the same time, you will see pictures on the piano of Chelsea and Hillary and Bill, because it's their family's home for those 4 years, but it's also where all these other people lived. And in fact, my next big book is going to be Abraham Lincoln. So I know that once I start on Abraham Lincoln, I'll want to go back again and see now where did he stay and where was his place and where was Mary Todd Lincoln. It's an extraordinary piece of our history because it's the one thing that binds our country together. We don't have a king, obviously, but we have this president. And the fact that almost all of them, except the early presidents, have lived in this same place, and so much history took place in those rooms, it really, you can't help but feel awe-inspired by being there. Once you do something and you feel you've learned the skills of how to do it, then it seems easier to do another book about a president. I mean, sometimes I keep thinking, well, maybe I'll write a novel or maybe I'll do something totally different. But then there's a part of you that says, but how do I know how to do that? So part of it is, I think, when you've learned how to do something, you want to get even deeper. I mean, I'm hoping that my book, for example, on Franklin Roosevelt was a better book than the one I wrote on the Kennedys, for the experience of having written 2 books before and learned how to bring the research to bear so that the characters can hopefully come alive for the readers. And Lincoln is really scary because that's back another whole century. There'll be nobody I can interview, as I could interview people for Roosevelt and Kennedy and Johnson. And I was thinking I wouldn't take on Lincoln till I was 70 or so, because it seems like the Moby Dick of historians. But the Civil War is so fabulously interesting, and so is he. So you get a certain confidence that comes from each book. And maybe there's a part of me, that's why I'm happy to be doing this memoir on growing up in Long Island in the 50s, because I've never done something like that before. So it is branching out a little bit. But another side of you, once you start in one field, you just want to deepen yourself in that field rather than go off in 25 directions. And the wonderful thing about it has been that, first of all, each era that you study is so new that you're learning all the time. I mean, 90% of the 6 years that I spent on the Roosevelts was reading about World War II, reading about these fabulous people, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. There's so few other fields where so much of what you do, your mind is being expanded. You're just learning. And you can sort of justify reading anything. I was reading novels about World War II. I was reading about the Air Force. I could read about battles, and you can all say this is all part of it. So you read it with an intensity that when you're just reading generally, you might not do. So to now, as I start reading about the Civil War, I mean, there's 20,000 million books I could have to read, but I can pick the ones and know that I'm learning something that I didn't know before. That's the glory of writing. It's not even so much the writing, it's what you learn, especially history, because not so much of it is research. I was thinking about this not long ago because I was lucky enough this past year to win the Pulitzer Prize for history. And when you are an historian, there's probably nothing that matters more than to be chosen by the colleagues in your own profession as what you think of as the height of that profession. And I had to give a talk right after that to some young people. And the most important thing to tell them, I think, is that you can't ever know that it's going to turn out that way. You can't start out at 20 in whatever your profession is and say, I want to win an Olympic medal, I want to become president, I want to win the Pulitzer Prize when I started out being an historian. But if you love what you're doing, then it's sort of a nice thing that happens toward the end of your career or in the middle of your career, but it's not the reason you were doing it. The reason you're doing it is because every day you wake up in the morning, you can't wait to get to learn something new, in my case, to learn something about history and to be able to communicate it to other people who can hopefully like it half as much as you do. And then if the rewards come along the way, it's almost a byproduct of it rather than the thing that you're searching for. I think sometimes when you're young, you want the thing to validate who you are rather than that the thing that is most important is what you do every single day and your enjoyment of it. I'd like to think that what my style of writing is an attempt not so much to judge the characters that I'm writing about, to expose them, to label them, to stereotype them, but instead to make them come alive for the reader with all their strengths and their flaws intact, so that there's not a way in which when I start the book I say, I'm going to make Franklin great or I'm going to get Franklin Roosevelt, but rather I want to render him as he lived day by day. For example, I found an usher's diary at the Roosevelt Library that recorded what Franklin and Eleanor did every day. Awakened at 6:30, had breakfast with Henry Stimson, had lunch with Joe Lash or whatever. I could then go to the diaries of the people they had lunch or breakfast with to record what they said at breakfast or lunch. Eleanor wrote 25 letters a day to her friends. I got every single one of those letters and figured out what her mood was like on that day, made a huge chronology before I even started the book of 1940 to 45, the years I was covering, so that I could recreate every day, in a certain sense, in their lives. Eleanor wrote a column every day, which often reflected what she was feeling that day. And for the reader, what that meant, not that the book went every day from 40 to 45, because you'd have themes in the book in terms of civil rights or battles of the war, but I tried to ground every issue in a day experience so that the reader could feel what it was like to be Franklin and Eleanor at that time, which means that if they made mistakes, you could at least understand why they did. If they did something admirable, you could feel it with them. So your emotions would go on a roller coaster as you were reading the book. At times you'd feel great about Franklin, at other times you'd be mad at Eleanor, and vice versa. But it's not a question of coming at it from the start as if I'm out to get them or out to praise them. I just want them to come alive again. That's all you really ask of history. And then the reader can feel with all the complexity of emotions what it is that's happening to them. And I'd like to think that's what the Pulitzer Prize people recognized, was that desire to make them come alive without an agenda to try and push them into a labeled stereotype. As much research as you think you're doing, you're going to mess up without a question. I mean, there are sometimes, I got the date of Roosevelt's birthday wrong. I can't believe it. I knew what his birthday was, and somehow I typed it wrong into the typewriter. And in the first edition of the book, I had it the wrong day. And then immediately one reader called me up. Luckily now, the great thing about books is they print new and new editions every few weeks, so you can correct your mistakes. And then the next edition that comes out had the right date in it. But there'll be more serious things like that you might get wrong. Somebody will come up to you afterwards and say, you just didn't interpret this right. I was there, and maybe you didn't interview that person. And what I think I've learned is that you're never going to get it all right, and you can't obsess about having a fact wrong or a date wrong or something like that, as long as you tried as best you could, and some of them you'll be able to change with the new editions of the book or the paperback. But even if it's still wrong, if it's not meant, if you've done the kind of research that you're sure is pretty good, then you've just had to have confidence in it so that nothing is perfect in life. And I think that's what the criticism has helped me to understand. Because sometimes people will find things that are wrong. Sometimes they'll even find an approach that you took wrong. And if you think you took the right approach, then the criticism, you just absorb it, but you don't change your mind. Sometimes you read something and you'll say, that person's right. That I didn't spend enough time on that subject, and I wish I had. And then you'll just know, well, next time I'll think about that. When the first book came out on Lyndon Johnson, before the reviews came out, I was certainly not sure how it would be received. It was the first, I had never even written articles before, much less a book. And I was young in writing it, and a lot was riding on it because I needed to stay teaching for my tenure at Harvard. I needed it for my reputation as an historian. So I remember in those months before the book came out being quite scared. There's no question. And the weird thing is, luckily the reviews were wonderful. So I had this quick sense of being able to feel somewhat confident about it. But then you'd think once the first one was really successful, then you'd be fine when the second one came out. But I got nervous all over again. And I think you almost have to. I think it's like anybody who performs. If you're not nervous each time a new book comes out, or even when I'm writing a book, if I finish one chapter, and then I go to write the next chapter, I wonder, can I write this next chapter? What do I have to say? I don't really remember what I'm going to do. So you never feel so confident, even if it's accumulated over a period of time, that you lose that sense of worry about what it's going to be like. And maybe one of these books will not work, and then it's going to be much tougher to have to absorb that. I haven't had that experience yet, but it certainly might happen. To be honest, when I think about Lincoln, that's probably the scariest one because so much has been written about him. And I have to make sure before I finish it that I have an angle that other people haven't quite used, or else you really might have the people saying, well, why did she choose this subject when so much else has been written about it? And that one scares me in prospective, but I'm 5 years away, so hopefully by the time I get to the end of it, I'll have figured out something that at least I feel is different because I did it, rather than just saying what everyone else said, I hope. Not completely confident. I don't think I'll feel confident until I find the solution. I've been able to do it before. Luckily, all three of the subjects before were ones that had been written about a lot: Lyndon Johnson, the Kennedys, and the Roosevelts. And it's not so much that you come up with a totally original approach. It's just that your story is somewhat different from the other ways that other people have done it. I don't quite know how to do that yet with Lincoln. So until I figure that out, I won't feel confident. But I have a lot of time. Well, I think what really drew me to graduate school, as I say, more than being a writer, was the thought that I wanted to be a teacher. And I loved teaching at Harvard. I mean, it was so much fun. This course that I taught on the presidency had like 350 kids in it, and they were it was in the late 60s, early 70s, so the kids were so politically active at that time. You couldn't get through a lecture without kids arguing with you, and it was wonderful. I mean, much more lively in some ways than it is today, unfortunately. It was a wonderful time to become a young teacher. I also taught seminars. And probably had it not been for the fact that I had got married and had kids and didn't feel I could do it all, I would still be teaching today. I still lecture a lot around the country, so I can get that touch with young students. And I've just been elected to the Board of Overseers at Harvard, so I'll be back at Harvard. My youngest son is about to become a freshman at Harvard, so I can oversee what he does the next 4 years by being on the Board of Overseers. So I haven't really left Harvard. I keep going back and doing seminars and stuff there, but it's not a full-time job anymore. When I was at Harvard in graduate school, I was in a seminar with the great psychologist Erik Erikson, and I remember he taught us, or tried to teach us, that the richest lives in the long run somehow balance work, love, and play in equal order. And he tried to define for us what that meant. He said you have to commit yourself equally to each of those realms. Work is the obvious one, with the perseverance and the disciplines to do something that you love and do it well. But he said even in the spheres of love and play, love meaning friendships, family, children, you have to commit yourself in time and in energy and emotion so that they really become an important part of your life. And even play, he said, if you're going to be involved in a sport, if it's a participant sport, you have to play it enough so that you can enjoy it. Or if it's a spectator sport, follow it fully enough so it really becomes an emotional part of you. And I think the most important thing when he taught me that, I didn't listen at all. At that time, I was working for Lyndon Johnson. I was still teaching at Harvard, or a graduate student at Harvard. And I thought, I can worry about marriage and play later. Work is what really matters. And it was only the experience of watching Lyndon Johnson, as I said earlier, that taught me that he hadn't the play part of his life. He didn't have the love part of his life, and that the balancing was really important. And I think what I learned more than anything was that you can't have it all balanced perfectly at any one time. When I was young, it was much more balanced toward work. When I had my children, it was much more balanced toward love and family, and I didn't get a lot of work done. But you've got lots of time left. My youngest is about to go to college, so I'll have a lot more time than I've had before, and I'll be able to do more work than I did before. So you can't ask of it to be perfectly balanced at any time, but what you hope is before you die, you've somehow had each of those spheres come to life, because I think that's probably more important than the success in one of those spheres alone. One of the qualities I think so important that's often overlooked is just energy, is vitality and sort of a life force that some people have and others don't. And probably that's connected to a love of whatever it is that they're doing. Another quality that I think is central is confidence. And again, some people are more blessed with that than others. When I look at Franklin Roosevelt's leadership, I think the most important quality he had during the Depression and the war was this absolute confidence in himself, in his country, really, and in the American people. And he was able to exude that confidence and almost project it. So when the people in the country heard him speak in these fireside chats, they said, yeah, it's going to be okay. We'll get through this depression, or we'll win this war. And I think confidence comes from doing something well, working at it hard, and you build it up. It's not something you're born with. You have to build the confidence as you go along. So I would say energy, vitality, confidence. Being willing to take risks at certain times, if it's something you believe in, is probably the hardest thing you've got to figure out, and that's where courage comes in. But I think in the long run, these qualities somehow all meld together in a way that it's hard to speak about them separately. During World War II, what you had was factories that were open 24 hours a day, people willingly going to ration goods in order to contribute to the overall goods in the economy, a sense that their sons, daughters, brothers were in the war somehow overseas, so they had to work at home to make it all work. And there's a sense of feeling larger than your own life when you're in some common mission together. Now, the sad thing is you got to hope it's not going to take a war to bring that back to our country again. And I think the one time when it seemed to be here in the early 1960s, the one thing that John Kennedy did above all else was to energize young people to feel that they wanted to give something to their country. It's what the Peace Corps was all about, what VISTA was all about, what the Civil Rights Movement was all about. That wasn't John Kennedy's doing, but the Civil Rights Movement was a big part of what made his presidency work. And I know, being a young person in that era, it was wonderful to be alive at that time. And I just hope for young people of this generation that they'll experience that feeling once again, that by working on large goals, they can do something more than their own individual ambition. I know from having been caught in the civil rights movement myself when I was young, it made those days much larger, and it was my experience of a war in a certain sense, going down to Mississippi Summer, going down to register people in the South. I value that more than almost anything else I've ever done. There were enemies. There were people in the South who didn't want the blacks registered for votes, but there was, more importantly, there was a sense of a brotherhood, of working for a goal that you knew was an important goal, that the country itself would be made better, and you were doing something not just for yourself, but something larger than yourself. That makes you feel bigger somehow. My husband worked for President Kennedy, was involved actually in writing the Peace Corps speech, worked for Lyndon Johnson, and did all the great voting rights speeches. So these kids know how much we believe in all this, but it's hard to penetrate the modern feeling, and I understand why they feel it, that politics is about special interests, that it's corrupt, that it's not really after these large goals that it was when we were there. Issues that are debated, the balanced budget, are not quite the same dimension as civil rights or the Voting Rights Act. I keep thinking that history runs in cycles and that someday these large issues will come before the country again. There'll be leaders that inspire young people. I don't think it means that it's over forever, but we're getting pretty impatient that I'm hoping it comes soon so that my young people can know that experience that we knew in the 60s and that the World War II generation knew during the 40s. I think what the American dream means to me is the fact that what founded this country, when I think about those posters that were put up in Europe, which said, "Come to America and you'll have golden sidewalks, the land will be yours," there was something so inspirational about the fact that these immigrants from all over the world felt that here was a place of freedom, a place of opportunity. There's still something about Ellis Island whenever I see it that makes me realize that the root in some ways of this country was that people felt that this was a new land without a class society, without an aristocratic background, where if you worked hard, you could become what you want to become. It's only partly true. I mean, obviously, there's racism in this society. There's economic benefits that go to people who are wealthy. There are some people who don't really have a chance. But on the other hand, there's always somebody that makes it through, even from the worst ghetto, that makes it through to the top of the society. And that's not true in a lot of other countries. And I think that's still what the American dream means, that with perseverance, with hard work, you can become something that the classes won't prevent you from becoming, that there's a movement up that ladder with hard work. I think if I were reading to a grandchild, I might read Tolstoy's War and Peace. I love literature and fiction. I mean, in fact, when I'm not reading from my own books, I tend to read fiction even more than nonfiction. But the kind of fiction that I love the most is ones that tell stories about characters and a time so that you learn from it at the same time. And I've read War and Peace several times, and it can take a whole summer. And if I had a grandchild to read it to, I can see taking a whole summer. They would learn about Russia. They would learn about history. They'd learn about human nature. They'd learn about, can the individual make a difference, or is it great forces? Tolstoy is always battling with those large issues. And mostly a whole world would come alive for them through that book. So I think I'd have a great time with that. Well, I think the most important thing is I remember in high school, the reason I would be paralyzed from writing so often was that they'd give us the wrong kind of assignments to write. I remember once this horrible essay having to write, "Experience is an arch under which we all walk." I had no idea what it meant, and I still don't know what it means to this day. And you'd sit there with abstract thoughts and try and write them on the paper. So the most important thing is whatever the assignment is that you're given to write, go out and find some small detail that you can write about. If you're describing a neighborhood, describing a house, describing a person, or describing a reaction to a book, so that you're bringing some material to the essay or whatever it is that you write. Do research, even if you're writing a college essay in some ways, you can do a little bit of research to bring it to life. You can't just expect it all to come from your head. I think the mistaken idea we have about writing is that somebody sits by a lake and they look at the clouds. There are poets who can do that, who generate their own thoughts with nothing other than what's in their head. 99% of the rest of the writing is from work. You build up. When I do research, I have done 90% of my time is the research. The other 10% is the writing. So I don't have to face a blank piece of paper. I can look at this as a quote I have from somewhere. This is an interview that I'm going to take from that. So it's not as scary as having to have it come from your head. So I think the most important thing I would tell kids is Don't think of it as something that has to come from your head. Even if you're writing a book report, go read other people's essays about that book. It doesn't have to just come from you. Think about what the other person said, then have your own reaction to it. And don't try and start the first paragraph. It's always impossible to have your first sentence and first paragraph. Start in the middle of the thing and then go back and write your first paragraph, because otherwise that's what can keep you for 3 days, is figuring out how am I going to open this thing, because the opening paragraph has so much weight to it. When I was younger, I somehow didn't understand that detail and information. I kept thinking it had to be big thoughts. And, if you're confronting, for example, you're writing about a book that you've read, if you're writing about Plato or Aristotle, and you're only 17 years old, how are you really going to understand what they're saying? So somehow, if I were to do it over again now, I would just take a piece of what they were saying and understand that and apply it to something else that I knew about, instead of trying to be a miniature Plato, which you cannot be at that time. So I never felt confident about writing until really I wrote the Lyndon Johnson book. Doing that, which came from research, came from just knowing that there were building blocks to writing as there is to anything else. And then once that confidence grew in that one, I thought the next book was better, and then the next one, hopefully after that, was better than that. Whenever I start a book, I make a very long outline, not so much A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, really paragraph outline of the episodes that I want to cover in the book. And it's before I know a lot when I do that. It's what I, as a lay person, would want to know about, say, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And then what happens, you get so deep into it that after a while you're off on a million tangents. And I always go back to the outline, because what it was in the outline that I wanted to know as a lay person is what the lay reader is probably going to want to know too. So it's a nice reminder to yourself, if you're getting so deep into something that really the reader's not going to care about it all. I mean, for example, when I was writing the Kennedy book, I've always loved medical history because I have 2 sisters who are nurses and a brother-in-law who's a surgeon. John Fitzgerald, Rose Kennedy's father, went to Harvard Medical School for a year in 1884. So I used it to write 30 pages about the state of medicine in the 1880s. What was anesthesia like? What were hospitals like? It was completely off the track, because as the editors finally said to me, this would be great if this man became a doctor, but he dropped out of medical school after a year and he became a politician. What are you doing? And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. And that's what happens sometimes. But if I'd gone back to my outline, I would have seen at the beginning I didn't think of having 30 pages on medicine in the 1880s. So sometimes that first brush of an outline tells you the general place you want to go with the book, and you got to trust that. It's sort of an instinct. When you become a specialist, you sometimes lose that layman's approach, so I always pull myself back to it by the outline. Well, I think in terms of writing, what I feel best about is the book on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and the fact that people who lived through that era in particular, who are now, say, in their 70s or 80s, who have written to me by the thousands and said that somehow it made them understand the era through which they lived. Because even when you live through an era, you're only seeing a part of it, understandably. And it's been a very wonderful feeling to know from them that I've given them an understanding of what was happening in the home front as a whole, if they were overseas or if they were in one piece of it, so that they feel their own sense of their own life has been enriched. And that means somehow even more than to the next generations who never experienced it, because that I've been used to. That's what you do when you write history mostly. It's for people who didn't live through it. But this has been a special thing that I've never experienced before. And that's a reading audience. And as I say, most of them are in their 70s, 80s. They have to be to have been young enough during that period of time to really have lived through it. So that's been terrific. One of the pleasures in doing the Roosevelt book was that I got to meet 2 of the Roosevelt children before they died. There were 5 Roosevelt children, and Jimmy and Elliot, 2 of the older boys, did die in the middle of my writing the book, but I met them at the beginning. And then I've met the whole generation of their children. I mean, there's like 40 young Roosevelts at a picnic where they had me come and speak to them. And you know that they have all these memories, that they knew their father, their grandfather. And even now when I go places sometimes and some woman will come up to me and say, I saw Eleanor Roosevelt. I never saw Eleanor Roosevelt. And there's that great feeling of, oh, you're so lucky. Tell me everything about it. And you want to hear everything about it because they can teach you even more. And sometimes you'll say, oh, I wish I knew that before. And somebody will tell you a great story that if you could have included it. But again, then you have to say the book had to end at some point. If you want to absorb everything like a vacuum, you'll never finish these things. So I've learned to not say, oh, this is horrible that I didn't know this before, but just say, oh, this is great. I know it now. Well, I think interviewing the people who either knew one of the characters or knew somebody who knew them is probably one of the great sources, and you learn so much from interviewing other people. It also makes the process of writing much less lonely than it would otherwise be, because I had to go out a lot during the period of writing and meet with these people. And if you interview, like, say, 5 people about the same incident and you see 5 different points of view, it makes you know that that's what makes history so complicated, that something doesn't just occur. It's not like a scientific event. It's a human event, so the dimensions of it will be seen differently by different people. So I think the value that I found in interviewing, that was for me an educational experience to just know that history itself is subjective, that you can't say it happened. You can do the best you can with what you think happened, but a lot of other people are going to see it happening differently. Well, I think the most important thing that I would say is the greatest reward I feel is that I love getting up in the morning, going into my study, and knowing that this profession that I've chosen is one that is open-ended, that I can keep learning. I keep thinking I can still do it when I'm 90 years old. It's a wonderful thing to not feel that unless some mental infirmity comes about, even if I can't walk anymore, I could still sit there reading. And I think there could have been a lot of other things I might have done and enjoyed. I might have liked to be a lawyer. I might have liked to be a public servant. So it's not as if there's only one thing meant for each person. But once you've gone down a path and you've gotten a certain confidence in it and a certain love in it, the love really deepens over time. I mean, I love being an historian now even more than I did 20 years ago. So I think the most important advice is that a person doesn't have to find that right away. It's not like their first attempt at finding a profession means that that's the only one they're going to find. And I might well have gone other paths, and it still might have been okay. But if you find something that you do love, and if it keeps deepening with each new experience in it, then just stay with it. And you can just know, I mean, if I could produce another 3 or 4 books before I die on presidents, that's all I'd ask, maybe even 2. I mean, it doesn't have to be 25 books, especially because they take me 5 or 10 years. There's no way I'd be able to do that. But it isn't even the book in the end. It's the process of knowing that every day I like what I'm doing, and I feel like I'm learning something new, and I can talk about it to people and enjoy it and share it, both in lectures and in the books themselves, finally, that makes it so worthwhile. You don't sort of imagine what somebody might have thought at a certain moment. Some writers feel like it's okay to just sort of go in the head of their subjects and make it up. I feel unless you can document and be certain about what it is that you're writing about, the reader's going to lose faith in your own integrity. So I try to make it come alive as much as possible by endless research, so I know what the room looked like when the person was in there. If somebody interviewed a person or a diary entry said what they said at a meeting, I can record that. But I think my integrity depends upon not stretching over that line that separates nonfiction from fiction, as too many nonfiction writers are doing nowadays, and they make it seem like a novel rather than actual nonfiction.